Hello and welcome to my talk. I will be presenting a systematic review on the genomic prediction of education outcomes. My name is Kirsty Warding and I work at the Hungry Mind Lab at the University of York in England, and I'm honoured to be presenting today the APS convention. So when we say genomic prediction, what do we mean? Well, here we mean genome-wide polygenic scores, or GPS. So what is a GPS? So traits such as IQ or education are influenced by DNA differences, and our likelihood to display these traits based on these differences is known as our genetic propensity. GPS are derived from genome-wide association studies that search individuals' genomes for DNA variants associated with a target trait. These DNA variants are known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. These SNPs can then be compared to a different sample of individuals where corresponding SNPs are aggregated together to derive a GPS that captures the genetic propensity for a particular trait for that individual. For this systematic review, we are only interested in a GPS for education. So like I said, a GPS is derived from a genome-wide association study, or GWAS. The largest GWAS study on education to date is by Li et al. In 2018 for years spent in education or education attainment, with 1.1 million participants. We know that previously a GPS calculated from the first education attainment GWAS predicted around 3% variance in the UK GCSE grades. This later increased to 10% variance for GCSE performance for GPS based on the second larger education attainment GWAS. So we know that with a larger sample size, the predictive power of GPS is greater. And that's why for this systematic review, we only reviewed literature that had derived a GPS based on this latest GWAS for education. So what were our research questions? Well, we were interested in what the strength of association between GPS and education outcomes were across studies, how many studies had reported an association between GPS and education, what populations and samples had been assessed and at what ages, and what methods had been used to estimate GPS. We were also interested in whether any factors affected this association between GPS and education. So the factors that we were interested in were the education outcome, so the type of outcome, whether that be school performance or years spent in education, as well as the sources of the outcome, whether it was self-reported or reported by a teacher, for example, as well as participant characteristics, so the number of participants within a study, the gender distribution of the sample, the age at assessment, as well as the nationality and ethnicity of the sample, and as well as how the GPS had been computed, how many SNPs had been retained for analysis, and as well as the GWAS sample size. For this systematic review, we followed the PRISMA protocol, which is an evidence-based list of items for developing review procedures. As you can see, we have pre-registered the protocol on the Open Science Framework and the systematic review on Prospero. We wanted to do a systematic review now because we think it's necessary for a comprehensive review of these studies and its findings to be done to chart the predictive power of a GPS for education, and as well as to evaluate the common methodological approaches within this research area. So how many papers did we find? So all our relevant papers were found from the citation of the GWAS study. Across two databases, Google Scholar and Web of Science, 1,100 hits were returned. After duplicates were deleted, that left us with 722 to be screened by title and abstract. Myself and the second author double screened independently 10% of the papers and made exclusions based on the criteria that either a paper didn't derive GPS based on the latest GWAS for education, or that it associated it to something other than a phenotypic measure of education. Or perhaps it was a review article because we were only interested in experimental original studies, or that it was in English. Both authors were in agreement with our exclusions, and so we carried on to the eligibility criteria, where 63 full texts were downloaded. We extracted and coded information from the methods and the results section, and exclusions could still be made at this point because we were only interested in papers that had reported an association between GPS and education in independent populations. So for example, if two papers had used the same sample but different education outcomes, they were both included. But if they'd used the same population sample, but this as well as the same education outcome, the earlier paper was included and the later paper was excluded. So this left 36 papers to be retained. We're still in the preliminary results part of this systematic review. However, we don't think that this studies retained will be able to be meta-analysed. And this is due to the heterogeneity across the studies. So we believe it will be a narrative synthesis. So these are some of our preliminary results. These are just a few of them, but you can see that GPS for education predicted a range of education outcomes from school performance to highest degree obtained, with small to medium effect sizes, suggesting that individuals with a higher genetic propensity for years spent in education perform better throughout compulsory schooling and are more likely to go on to further education, for example, university. So what does that look like? So in this first paper, you can see that GPS predicted school performance within children. So at age 16, you can see that the bottom and top GPS decile differed substantially, and that difference was between a grade C and a grade A. And in this second paper, they also predicted school performance, and you can see that over 7 to 16, those with a high GPS for education and high SES perform substantially better than the low GPS, low SES individuals. This paper also predicted education qualifications, and of the high group, 77% went on to attend university at age 18, compared to 21% of the low group. I mentioned earlier that we were interested in some factors. So from the retained studies, the phenotypic age of assessment varied between 7 and 70. The outcomes varied between school performance all the way to highest level of qualification obtained. And 93% of our studies had samples of European ancestry. In terms of the population origin, these are some of the most popular ones, and you can see that they were predominantly from the US, the UK, and Oz. We did find that the difference in strength of association varied minimally with age at and type of phenotypic assessment, as well as population origin and GPS estimation method. So what does this mean? So we know that since the 2018 GWAS for years spent in education, GPS has predicted a range of education outcomes, from school performance to highest degree obtained to years spent in education with medium effect sizes. Individuals with a higher genetic propensity are more likely to perform better throughout compulsory schooling, as well as attend higher education, for example, university. This illustrates the importance of genetics within education. This systematic review also charts the predictive power of GPS derived from the latest GWAS for years spent in education. And it highlights that the genomic prediction for education has increased from 0 to 15% over the past decade. With that, DNA-based prediction of education at an individual level rather than a group level may become possible. And therefore it is urgent that we discuss now the risks, potential advantages, and the necessary safeguarding measures for DNA-based predictions of education in science and in society at large. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. I would like to thank the other authors on this paper, Dr. Sophie von Strum and Dr. Ali Nancaro, as well as the Nuffield Foundation, who funded this research. Thank you again.